There is a shipyard sitting on 118 acres at the edge of Philadelphia, where the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers converge. It is the largest commercial shipbuilder in the United States, and it has not launched a single commercial vessel since 2019. Pull on that thread, and what unravels is one of the most consequential strategic failures in all of modern American industrial history. It is a story of how the world's greatest industrial power deliberately dismantled its own shipbuilding capacity and handed dominance to its chief rival. The United States currently builds fewer than 5 commercial ships per year. China, in 2024, captured 74% of all new global commercial orders. A single Chinese yard, the Jiangyan Shipyard on Chongqing Island, now has more capacity than every American shipyard combined. China's total shipbuilding capacity is roughly 232 times that of the United States, which accounts for less than 1% of global production. The U.S. is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. Yet, not a single U.S.-built LNG carrier is currently afloat. The last American-built LNG carrier was completed in 1980 and scrapped in 2021. 41 years of missed industrial history. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to when the United States was genuinely dominant, not just competitive, but overwhelmingly dominant. Between 1939 and 1945, American shipyards built nearly 40 million gross tons of merchant cargo, over 3,600 cargo ships, and 700 tankers. They built more ships during World War II than every other nation on Earth combined. That dominance did not evaporate overnight. Through the post-war decades, American yards delivered an average of around 20 commercial ships per year, supporting 187,000 workers at peak employment. None of that industrial strength happened by market forces alone. 3 laws were quietly holding the entire shipbuilding industry upright. The Jones Act of 1920 required that any vessel moving cargo between U.S. ports be American-built, American-owned, American-crewed, and American-flagged. Merchant Marine Act of 1936 allowed the federal government to cover up to 50% of the cost difference between building a ship domestically versus abroad. The Merchant Marine Act of 1970, signed by Nixon, expanded subsidies and set an ambitious 10-year target of 300 new commercial vessels built in American yards. These were not natural market conditions. They were deliberate policy decisions, and the entire industry existed only because of them. That arrangement came to an end in 1981. The Reagan administration looked at the subsidy program and concluded it was a distortion of the free market. In fiscal year 1982, the administration requested zero funding for new construction differential subsidy contracts, severing the link between operators and shipyards. Logic was clean and ideologically coherent. Subsidies distort markets, so let the yards compete or die, and they died. Within a few years, American commercial shipbuilding collapsed. Active yards dropped by 40%, and employment fell by a third nationwide. Major names like General Dynamics in Quincy, Sun Shipbuilding in Chester, and Bethlehem Steel in Sparrows Point all went under permanently. Commercial ship production fell from around 20 large ocean-going vessels per year to just 5 within 8 years. Roughly 75,000 jobs disappeared. Between 1987 and 1992, the U.S. sold only 8 commercial ships, over 1,000 gross tons total, compared to 77 per year in 1975. The Jones Act remained in place, preserving a small protected domestic market. A handful of yards survived on Jones Act work alone. They built tankers and barges for the Gulf Coast trade and container ships running between Hawaii and the mainland, keeping minimal activity alive. But the cost spiral was relentless. In the late 1920s, U.S.-built ships cost about 20% more than foreign equivalents. Today it is 400% more. The Jones Act fleet itself shrank from over 400 ships in 1950 to barely 100 today, a shadow of its former industrial self. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was doing exactly what the U.S. had stopped doing, subsidizing its shipbuilders aggressively and strategically. Japan dominated in the 1970s and 1980s. South Korea overtook Japan by the end of the 1990s. Then came China, its extraordinary rise. Between 2006 and 2013, the Chinese government spent roughly $91 billion in subsidies on its shipbuilding sector. The U.S. spent $1.5 billion. That is a 60 to -1 spending ratio. The result was predictable. China's share of global output grew from 5% in 2000 to over 50% by 2023. It was state capitalism versus the free market, and the free market got crushed. For 4 decades, most people did not notice. About 90% of global trade moves by sea, and the ships carrying American imports, exports, energy, and food are overwhelmingly built in China. In a major Pacific conflict, the United States would find itself depending on Chinese-built hulls to move its own military cargo across the ocean. China also produces 95% of the world's shipping containers, 86% of intermodal chassis, and 70% of port cranes used globally. The physical infrastructure of global trade is, at this point, mostly Chinese-made. The strategic implications are enormous and largely invisible to the public. Then there is the Navy. Naval shipbuilding survived the commercial collapse because it was federally funded, but it depended on the same industrial ecosystem. When commercial shipbuilding collapsed, that supporting industrial base collapsed too. The same welders, forge shops, specialty contractors, and supplier networks vanished. 2025 Government Accountability Office report found that all 37 Battle Force ships under construction that it reviewed were facing significant delays. The Navy has shrunk to roughly 290 ships against a stated goal of 355, and is expected to bottom out at 280 ships in 2027. Of the Navy's 49 fast attack submarines, nearly 40% are sitting in dry docks awaiting maintenance, with an average repair wait time of 3 years. The submarine industrial base has lost 12,000 suppliers since the 1990s, and over 75% of submarine parts now come from single-source suppliers. If one small foundry in Pennsylvania goes out of business, an entire weapons system can grind to a halt. The fragility is systemic. Commercial shipbuilding and naval power, it turns out, were never really separate things. They share the same industrial foundation beneath the surface. The U.S. government has finally started to acknowledge this. In April 2024, President Biden launched a Section 301 investigation into China's shipbuilding practices. A year later, President Trump signed Executive Order 14,269, titled Restoring America's Maritime Dominance, targeting Chinese-built and Chinese-operated vessels at U.S. ports. Port service fees were set at $50 per net ton, rising to $80 in April 2026, aimed at pushing orders toward Korean and Japanese yards. On the 1st of November, 2025, the Trump administration suspended those fees for 1 year as part of broader trade negotiations with China, softening the urgency significantly. On the legislative side, the SHIPS Act was introduced in December 2024 and reintroduced in April 2025 with ambitious long-term shipbuilding targets. It aims to expand the U.S. flag international fleet by 250 ships over 10 years and create a maritime security trust fund to subsidize the industry. A 25% investment tax credit for shipyard capital expenditures is also proposed, intended to incentivize private investment in new facilities and equipment. The 250 ship target requires the industrial base to grow roughly 5 times over in a single decade. That is wartime, scale mobilization of a dormant industry. In February 2026, the White House released America's Maritime Action Plan, the most ambitious U.S. maritime policy document since the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. But it arrived without attached funding. It still needs congressional approval, and the SHIPS Act remains stalled in legislative committee. The Section 301 fees are suspended. The executive plan is currently a list of recommendations, more than a program of action on the ground. So if policy is moving slowly, what is actually happening on the ground? The answer, with historical irony, is South Korea. In December 2024, the South Korean conglomerate Hanwha purchased Philly Shipyard outright for $100 million, the first Korean acquisition of an American yard. Philly Shipyard, built on a portion of the former Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, and in operation since 1997, had constructed nearly half of all large U.S. Jones Act commercial vessels. It was one of only two notable U.S. commercial yards still standing, the other being General Dynamics, NASCO, in San Diego. What Hanwha brought to the deal was not just capital. It was decades of accumulated industrial expertise built across multiple generations of shipbuilders. Hanwha Ocean, SGOJ Shipyard covers about 52.7 million square feet, roughly 900 football fields, employing 30,000 workers and housing the world's largest dry dock. Hanwha is also the world's leading LNG carrier builder, having been the first company to deliver 200 of them to global clients. While China has come to dominate shipbuilding in volume, South Korea has maintained its edge in quality and technological specialization above all others. The Philly acquisition was, above all, a technology transfer. Hanwha sent 50 Korean specialists from GOJ to install welding robots and modern production systems. Then in August 2025, Hanwha announced a $5 billion infrastructure plan to expand the Philadelphia yard with a goal of scaling to 20 ships per year. The workforce is planned to grow from 1,800 to as many as 10,000 workers over the course of the expansion under the new Korean ownership. In October 2025, at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, the U.S. and South Korea formalized a $350 billion bilateral investment framework together. Of that total, $150 billion was specifically allocated to a shipbuilding cooperation initiative called MASCA. Make American Shipbuilding Great Again. The branding is American, the money and the engineering are Korean. That asymmetry defines the entire partnership at its core. In exchange, South Korea secured a reduction of reciprocal tariffs to 15% from a threatened 25%, and U.S. support for its first nuclear submarines. China responded by sanctioning 5 Hanwha U.S. subsidiaries in October 2025. The geopolitical stakes of shipbuilding had become impossible to ignore. The U.S. fought the Korean War to preserve South Korea's existence. 70 years later, it has turned to South Korea to help preserve its own industrial capacity. What is being rebuilt is not American shipbuilding in the traditional sense. It is something newer and stranger, an American-Korean industrial hybrid. It runs on Korean capital, Korean engineering, and American labor, all operating under the framework of American industrial policy and national security priorities. Whether any of this will actually work is an open question. China still controls more than half the global order book at far lower cost. Chinese yards remain 4 to 5 times cheaper than their competitors. The policy framework in Washington is incomplete, and the funding is still uncertain. The gap to be closed is enormous, and for the first time in 4 decades, the United States is making a serious attempt to rebuild what it chose to dismantle. The story of how America got here, and what it is trying to do now, is one of the more revealing case studies in what happens when ideology meets industrial reality.